Dawn painted Bitter Creek's gallows crimson as blood, the same color as the stolen necklace that had condemned Marlowe Thorne to hang. The 23-year-old seamstress stood straight-backed despite the noose. Judge Blackwood adjusted his expensive pocket watch, impatient to conclude the territory's justice. Below the platform, townsfolk gathered with mixed expressions, some bloodthirsty, others uneasy at such severe punishment for theft. Sheriff Wade studied his boots, avoiding the condemned woman's steady gaze. "Let this serve as a reminder that theft will not be tolerated," Blackwood intoned, as the executioner tightened the noose. Marlowe closed her eyes, a small letter about her missing sister sewn into her dress hem. Nobody noticed the disheveled cowboy weaving through the crowd. As the trap-door lever creaked backward, a drunken voice shattered the ritual. "Stop that rope!" Caleb Mackenzie staggered forward, whiskey bottle in hand. "Judge Blackwood?" he slurred. "Or is it Blackstone?" A seemingly drunken cowboy, a corrupt judge with a hidden past, and a young woman with seconds to live. The scales of frontier justice hang in precarious balance. Who is Caleb Mackenzie really, and what does he know about Judge Blackwood's secrets? Comment with your theories about what connects these characters. Like if you're drawn into this tale of deception and redemption in the Wyoming territory. And subscribe for more stories where justice comes at the highest price. Sometimes the most dangerous man in town is the one everyone underestimates. Dawn crept into Marlowe Thorne's cell like a reluctant visitor, casting thin golden bars across the stone floor. She sat perfectly still on the narrow cot, needle flashing in the growing light as she made the final stitches on a small piece of fabric. 23 years old and condemned to hang for stealing a necklace she'd never touched. The jail was quiet, save for the distant sounds of hammering, the gallows being readied for its morning duty. Marlowe's fingers didn't tremble as she worked the needle, though inside her heart beat against her ribs like a trapped bird, not for herself, but for the sister she'd never find now. She paused to touch the hidden pocket she'd sewn into her dress hem, feeling the small, folded letter inside. "I'll find you, Emma," she whispered to the empty cell. "In this life or the next." The sound of boots on wooden floors broke her reverie. Deputy Harkins appeared at the bars, a tin plate in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. "Brought your breakfast, Miss Thorne," he said, not meeting her eyes as he unlocked the door. "Judge says to make yourself presentable for the proceedings." "Kind of him to worry about appearances," Marlowe replied evenly. "Even for a hanging." Harkins shifted uncomfortably. "Just following orders, miss." He left quickly, as though her calm dignity made him more uneasy than tears would have. Marlowe set aside her sewing and crossed to the small barred window, watching as townsfolk began to gather in the square, drawn by the morbid spectacle of frontier justice. In the distance, the gallows stood stark against the morning sky, a dark promise waiting to be kept. Marlowe straightened her shoulders. If today was her last, she would face it standing tall. Judge Elliot Blackwood adjusted his expensive pocket watch with manicured fingers, the gold gleaming in contrast to the weathered boards of the gallows platform. Below, the citizens of Bitter Creek stood in uneasy clusters, their faces a mixture of morbid fascination and discomfort. A public hanging wasn't unusual in Wyoming territory, but the crime seemed to many hardly worth the punishment. "Proceed," Blackwood instructed the sheriff, his voice carrying across the square. Sheriff Thomas Wade avoided Marlowe's eyes as deputies led her up the 13 steps. Her wrists were bound before her, but she walked steadily, her gaze scanning the crowd as though searching for a particular face. Blackwood cleared his throat, smoothing his well-tailored coat. "Marlowe Thorne, you have been found guilty of theft from the home of a respectable citizen." Let this serve as a reminder that Bitter Creek is a town of law and order. The theft of property from upstanding citizens will not be tolerated, regardless of the offender's circumstances. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Hanging for a necklace?" someone whispered. "Ain't right." "Hush!" came the swift reply. "You want to be next?" The executioner, a man brought in from Cheyenne for the occasion, slipped the noose over Marlowe's head, adjusting it with professional detachment. She stood tall, despite the rough hemp against her neck, eyes now fixed on the distant mountains, as though already seeing beyond this world. "To proceed with the execution," Judge Blackwood commanded, stepping back with a nod to the executioner. The crowd grew hushed, the only sound the creak of rope as the executioner tested the mechanism one final time. Marlowe closed her eyes. The letter about her sister, a small comfort against her ankle. She had failed, but perhaps someone else would continue the search. Just as the executioner reached for the lever, a slurred voice shattered the ritual silence. "Hold! Hold that rope!" The crowd parted reluctantly as a disheveled man staggered through, whiskey bottle dangling from one hand. His clothes were trail-worn, his beard unkempt, but his eyes, sharp and clear despite his apparent drunkenness, fixed on the judge with unsettling intensity. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Blackwood demanded, face flushing with anger. "Got something to say about this farce of justice?" the man slurred, stumbling closer to the gallows. He took a swig from his bottle, some of the amber liquid spilling down his chin. "Hanging a girl for a trinket. Mighty harsh sentence, Judge." "Remove this drunkard immediately," Blackwood ordered, gesturing to the deputies. The man lurched forward, evading their grasp with surprising agility for someone so apparently intoxicated. "Judge Blackwood?" he called out, louder now. "Or is it Blackstone?" A hush fell over the crowd. The judge's face went pale, then flushed crimson. "I said, remove him!" Blackwood's voice cracked slightly. Sheriff Wade stepped between the drunk and the deputies. "I'll handle this, Judge." He turned to the man, lowering his voice. "Name?" "Caleb Mackenzie," the drunk replied, suddenly sounding considerably more sober. "And I got evidence that'll hang the hanging judge." Wade studied him for a long moment, then turned to Blackwood. "Judge, given the nature of these accusations, perhaps we should delay the execution. Give me 48 hours to sort this out." As the deputies led Caleb away, he passed close to Marlowe. "Your sister," he whispered, pressing a small folded paper into her bound hands. "I know why you really came to Bitter Creek." The noose was removed from Marlowe's neck, but the reprieve felt as tenuous as morning mist. The lock clicked behind Sheriff Wade as he stepped into Caleb's cell, moving deliberately to keep his spurs from announcing his presence to the jail's other occupants. Caleb sat on the narrow cot, no longer swaying with feigned drunkenness. In the lantern light, his eyes were clear and calculating. "You're no drunk," Wade said quietly, studying the man who'd disrupted an execution and thrown the town into whispers. "Who are you, really?" Caleb straightened, his posture transforming as the facade fell away. He reached slowly into his boot, extracting a small tarnished badge. "Deputy U.S. to Marshal Caleb Mackenzie." "Been tracking your Judge Blackwood for 3 months. Marshal?" Wade's hand instinctively moved away from his pistol. "You should have come to me directly. And miss the warm welcome?" Caleb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Wasn't sure where you stood, Sheriff. Blackwood has most local lawmen in his pocket." Wade checked the window, ensuring no one was listening. "I've had suspicions about Blackwood since he arrived 2 years ago. Man with too much money and too little past." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "But suspicion isn't evidence. It's not just about corruption. Caleb lowered his voice. 5 women have disappeared, federal witnesses who were supposed to testify about land fraud in Pennsylvania. I think they're connected to Blackwood, or should I say Henry Blackstone, former circuit judge from Pennsylvania. Wade reached for the bottle on his desk, pouring 2 measures of whiskey. He offered one to Caleb, who stared at the amber liquid for a long moment before shaking his head. "Got 48 hours before they hang that girl," Wade said, noting Caleb's refusal with a raised eyebrow. "What's your plan?" "First, we need to get into Blackwood's house. His real records aren't at the courthouse." Wade nodded slowly. "That won't be easy. Man's got the place guarded like a fortress." Night had settled over the jail when a scraping sound drew Caleb from his thoughts. He watched, puzzled, as a section of the cell wall seemed to shift. A brick moved, then another, revealing a narrow opening and a face peering through. "Mr. Freeman?" Caleb whispered, recognizing the blacksmith who'd nodded to him in the crowd earlier. Elijah Freeman's dark eyes scanned the cell before he slipped inside through an opening that seemed impossibly small for his broad shoulders. The wall closed behind him with barely a sound. "These walls have ears, Marshal," Elijah said softly. "And eyes, too, if you know where to look." "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," Caleb replied, careful to keep his voice low. "You helped my boy when no one else would." Elijah's expression remained guarded, but his words carried weight. "Those men would have beaten him half to death for walking too close to Mrs. Blackwood. I owe you." "How'd you know I was a marshal?" Elijah's smile was brief. "Man who moves like you ain't no drunk. Besides, the judge has had his boot on this town's neck too long. Some of us been watching, waiting." The floorboards creaked overhead, and both men froze. When the footsteps passed, Elijah pulled a rough piece of charcoal from his pocket and knelt, sketching a crude map on the stone floor. "You need a way into Blackwood's house? I built half this town, Marshal. There ain't a wall in Bitter Creek I can't pass through like a ghost." He pointed to markings on his rough map. Tunnel runs from the old mine shaft, right under the town, branches to most buildings. Blackwood's office has a hidden entrance behind the bookcase, eastern wall. Caleb studied the map. "What about his safe?" "Behind the painting of some mountain. Combination changes weekly." Elijah extended his hand. "My boy's life is worth something. Yours too, I reckon." Their handshake sealed an alliance before Elijah disappeared back into the wall like a spirit. Victoria Blackwood stood at her bedroom window, the lace curtains providing just enough cover to observe her husband in the garden below. The moon cast everything in silver, making the scene seem like a strange dream. Elliot on his knees in the dirt, burying something in a hole beside the rose bushes. She'd married him for security, for the promise of position in this rough frontier town. 2 years of comfort and status had seemed worth the occasional chill in his manner, his secretiveness, the way his eyes never quite matched his smile. But lately, the whispers about missing women had reached even her sheltered ears. When her husband returned to the house, Victoria slipped downstairs and out the servants' entrance, a dark shawl concealing her pale dress. The newspaper office was dark, save for a single lamp in the back room. "You came," Sarah Larson said, surprise evident in her voice as she opened the door. The newspaper owner's face was lined with the cares of a woman who'd built a business alone in a town that resented her independence. "He buried something in the garden tonight. Papers, I think." Victoria glanced nervously over her shoulder. "This isn't the first time. Did he see you watching?" "No." Victoria twisted her wedding ring anxiously. "Something's wrong, Sarah." "The way he reacted when that drunk mentioned Blackstone." Sarah ushered her inside, locking the door. You're taking a risk coming here. I took a risk when I lied about that girl stealing my necklace, Victoria whispered, her hand going to her throat where the ruby pendant still hung. I need to know what else I've been complicit in. Sarah removed a stack of newspaper clippings from a drawer. These are all women who worked in your home, Victoria. All disappeared without a trace. Victoria stared at the faces, recognition dawning with sickening clarity. The last one, the seamstress's sister. She organized Elliot's study the week before she vanished. The newspaper office basement smelled of ink and old paper, the low ceiling forcing Caleb to stoop slightly as he studied the map spread across Sarah Larson's desk. Sheriff Wade stood opposite him while Elijah Freeman secured the door behind them. Blackwood's property sits here, Wade said, pointing to a location marked in ink. Main house, stables, and a guest house where he conducts private business. Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he tried to trace a path through the tunnels Elijah had drawn. He clenched his fist, fighting the familiar craving that had been his constant companion for 3 years. 3 years of drowning guilt in whiskey, and now, when clarity mattered most, his body rebelled. "You all right, Marshal?" Sarah asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Fine," Caleb muttered, reaching for the cup of black coffee she'd provided. "The safe is our priority. If Blackwood kept documentation from Pennsylvania, that's where we'll find it." Wade frowned. "I don't like it. If you're caught in his house, there's nothing I can do officially. He'll hang you alongside the girl." "Then we don't get caught," Caleb replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Elijah knows the tunnels. I can crack the safe." 2 hours, in and out. Elijah shook his head. "Begging your pardon, Marshal, but you're in no state for this. When's the last time you were sober?" Caleb met his gaze steadily. "About 3 years ago, when my brother was hanged by another corrupt judge." A heavy silence fell over the room. "We have less than 36 hours before they hang that girl," Sarah said finally. "Your personal demons can wait." "You can barely hold a pencil," Wade observed. "How do you expect to crack a safe with those hands?" Caleb took a deep breath. "Because this time, I won't fail. I can't." The unspoken question hung in the air. Could a broken lawman find redemption, or was Marlowe Thorne already as good as dead? Dust and cobwebs clung to Caleb's clothing as he crawled through the narrow passage behind Blackwood's study wall. Elijah moved ahead silently, his knowledge of the hidden tunnels unerring. The passageway was barely 3 feet high in places, forcing them to crouch uncomfortably. "These passages were for servants," Elijah whispered, "designed to keep us invisible." "How long have they been unused?" Caleb asked, fighting claustrophobia. "Since Blackwood fired all the colored staff last year, after Bessie disappeared." Elijah's voice carried no emotion, but his shoulders tensed at the memory. They reached a section of wall that looked identical to the rest, but Elijah pressed a specific brick, causing a panel to swing inward. They slipped into Blackwood's study, a room of dark wood and leather-bound books that spoke of Eastern wealth transported to the frontier. Caleb's eyes adjusted quickly to the dim light filtering through heavy curtains. The painting Elijah had described, a majestic mountain scene, hung prominently on the wall. Behind it, just as expected, was a small but sturdy safe. Caleb wiped his sweating palms on his trousers, willing his hands to steady as he pressed his ear to the metal door. The tumblers clicked faintly as he rotated the dial, a skill learned from a reformed safecracker who'd taught him that patience mattered more than steady hands. After several tense minutes, the lock surrendered with a satisfying click. Caleb swung the door open, only to stare in disbelief. "Damn it," he muttered. "It's empty." The safe contained nothing but a single yellowed newspaper clipping from Pennsylvania bearing the headline, "Judge Blackstone investigated for missing court funds." Elijah tensed suddenly. "Someone's coming. Judge's footsteps. I know the sound." They barely had time to close the safe and replace the painting before slipping back into the passage, the study door opening just as the wall panel clicked shut behind them. Sheriff Wade returned to his office to find 3 deputies waiting, their postures suggesting this wasn't a social call. Deputy Harkins leaned against the desk, Wade's desk, with deliberate disrespect. "Something I can help you boys with?" Wade asked mildly, hanging his hat on the rack. "Judge wants to know why you're spending time with that drunk," Harkins said, straightening up. The other deputies spread out slightly, blocking the exits. Wade moved to his chair, forcing Harkins to step aside. "Keeping my enemies close, Harkins. Man's been asking too many questions around town." "That's so?" Harkins didn't sound convinced. "Funny thing is, Billy saw you heading into the newspaper office with Freeman. Kind of meeting that raises questions." Wade kept his expression neutral as he opened his desk drawer, casually placing his hand near the pistol inside. "Since when does the sheriff need to explain his movements in his own town?" "Judge remembers how he helped you after that business with the Hayes Ranch," Harkins said, his voice lowering. "Says loyalty goes both ways." The reminder struck like a physical blow. 2 years ago, Wade had been deep in gambling debt, about to lose everything. Blackwood had settled his markers in exchange for occasional blind eyes turned. "Tell the judge I haven't forgotten," Wade said, his voice hardening. "I know where my bread is buttered." Harkins studied him for a long moment before nodding. "See that you do. Judge says the hanging proceeds tomorrow at dawn, drunk's accusations or not." After the deputies left, Wade pulled out a sheet of paper, quickly scribbling a warning about Blackwood's suspicions. He folded it and called to a young boy sweeping the boardwalk outside. "Jimmy, take this to the newspaper office. Tell Miss Larson it's about tomorrow's edition." He pressed a penny into the boy's hand. "Quick now, and not a word to anyone." The choice was made. There would be no going back. The wall of Sarah Larson's back office had become a tapestry of tragedy. Newspaper clippings, daguerreotypes, and handwritten notes connected by red string. 7 women's faces stared out from the collage, their expressions frozen in time. 7 women in 3 years, Sarah explained as Caleb studied the pattern. All connected to the Blackwood household. "And Marlowe Thorne's sister?" Caleb asked, finding a face with a familiar resemblance to the woman awaiting execution. "Emma Thorne," came a soft voice from the doorway. Victoria Blackwood stood there, veiled and trembling slightly. "She was my personal maid, disappeared 3 months ago, the night after she organized my husband's study." Caleb straightened, instinctively moving his hand toward his concealed weapon. "Mrs. Blackwood." "She's been helping me," Sarah said quickly. "Victoria's been gathering information from inside the house." Victoria stepped forward, placing a household ledger on the table. "Emma found something while organizing his papers. The night she disappeared, I heard arguing from his study. The next morning, my husband said she'd left town suddenly." "And the necklace?" Caleb asked pointedly. Victoria's hand went to her throat, fingers brushing the ruby pendant. "He instructed me to claim it was stolen, said Marlowe had been asking too many questions about her sister." Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know he meant to hang her. I thought perhaps a few days in jail." Caleb studied the map Sarah had created. Each woman had access to his personal papers. Each disappeared after potentially finding something connecting him to Henry Blackstone. A knock at the door interrupted them. Doc Wilson entered, carrying a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "Found something you might be interested in, Marshal," he said. unwrapping the bundle to reveal a tarnished judicial badge from Pennsylvania. Dug this out of my supplies. Took it off a man who came through town last year, claiming he was searching for Judge Blackstone. Man died of fever the next day. The physical evidence confirmed what they all suspected. Blackwood and Blackstone were one and the same. Victoria Blackwood waited until her husband left for court before slipping into his study. Morning sunlight streamed through the curtains she deliberately left partially open, providing enough light for her search without requiring a lamp. She moved methodically through the room, checking behind books, beneath the leather desk pad, inside hollow decorative globes. Her husband's study had always been forbidden territory, his reaction severe on the few occasions she'd entered uninvited. Now she understood why. The carpet beneath his desk caught her attention, one corner slightly askew. Victoria knelt, pulling it back to reveal a loose floorboard. Her heart raced as she pried it up with trembling fingers, finding a small compartment containing a locked wooden box. The key proved unnecessary. The lock was flimsy and yielded to a letter opener's pressure. Inside lay a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with faded ribbon. Victoria untied them with shaking hands, opening the first letter. "My dearest Henry," she read aloud, the feminine handwriting flowing across the page. "Your monthly payments are appreciated, but cannot replace a husband. If you ever hope to return to Pennsylvania, the court must believe—" She stopped, her breath catching as the signature came into view. "Your devoted wife, Margaret Blackstone." Victoria's wedding ring suddenly felt heavy on her finger as reality crashed down upon her. Not Elliot Blackwood, but Henry Blackstone. Not a respected judge, but a fugitive. Not her husband, but another woman's. More letters revealed a pattern of payments sent to Pennsylvania, along with threats should Margaret ever reveal he was still alive. Bank drafts and transfer records showed the steady flow of money, hush money, to maintain his freedom and false identity. "I'm not even legally married to him," Victoria whispered, the enormity of the deception overwhelming her. She carefully resealed the box, but took one letter with her, evidence that would help destroy the man who had made her an unwitting accomplice to his crimes. Sarah Larson's office had become a war room, the table covered with evidence of Blackwood's, or rather Blackstone's, double life. Victoria sat rigidly in a chair as Caleb examined the letter she'd brought. "This confirms everything," he said, comparing the handwriting to the Pennsylvania newspaper clipping. "Henry Blackstone, former circuit judge who embezzled nearly $50,000 from the court, then disappeared during the investigation. He arrived here with enough money to buy the largest house in town and secure a judgeship within months," Victoria said hollowly. No one questioned where the money came from. Sheriff Wade leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Territorial appointments don't get much scrutiny out here. Man with money and Eastern education practically gets handed a gavel. And when witnesses became suspicious," Caleb let the implication hang in the air. "They disappeared," Victoria finished, her face pale. "And I helped him, with that poor girl and the necklace." "You can help us stop him now," Sarah said gently, "before Marlowe Thorne hangs for your lie." Caleb carefully folded the letter, adding it to their growing collection of evidence. "We need to get this to the federal judge in Cheyenne. With your testimony, Victoria, we can stop the execution and arrest Blackwood." "Dawn's less than 18 hours away," Wade reminded them. "Nearest telegraph is in Copper Springs, half-day's ride." Victoria twisted her wedding ring, then slowly removed it, placing it with the evidence. "I'll testify. Whatever it takes to make this right." "We need to move quickly," Caleb said, gathering the documents. "I'll ride to Copper Springs, send a telegraph to the federal courthouse. Wade can—" A gunshot from outside interrupted him, followed by shouts and the sound of running boots. "They've found us," Wade said grimly, drawing his revolver. "Looks like Blackwood's decided to take matters into his own hands." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Caleb rode toward Copper Springs, dust rising from his horse's hooves. The leather satchel containing their evidence was secured inside his coat, pressed against his chest. If he pushed hard, he could reach the telegraph office before nightfall. The trail narrowed as it entered a rocky pass between two ridges, a natural bottleneck that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Caleb slowed his mount, eyes scanning the high ground on either side. The birds had gone silent, and the stillness felt unnatural. Sunlight glinted off metal in the rocks above, a rifle barrel catching the light. Caleb threw himself sideways as the shot cracked through the air, the bullet grazing his shoulder instead of finding his heart. His horse reared in panic as two more shots kicked up dirt at its hooves. "Judge Blackwood sends his regards, Marshal," called a voice from the rocks. Caleb rolled behind a boulder, drawing his Colt as he moved. So he knows. Knew all along. The voice was closer now. Deputy Harkins moving into position. "Says to tell you your badge won't be found with your body." "Neither will yours," Caleb replied, steadying his aim despite the burning pain in his shoulder. He fired twice in quick succession, satisfaction flaring as a cry of pain told him at least one shot had found its mark. A fusillade of bullets chipped away at his cover, forcing him lower to the ground. Caleb counted 3 distinct shooters, including the wounded Harkins. He needed to move. The boulder wouldn't protect him forever, and they'd eventually flank his position. Grabbing a fallen branch, he tossed it to his right, drawing fire while he scrambled left toward a cluster of scrub pine. The move nearly succeeded, but a sharp pain exploded in his shoulder as a bullet found him. Caleb bit back a cry, pressing onward through the underbrush. His horse had bolted during the initial gunfire, but if he could reach the creek bed, he might lose his pursuers in the rocky terrain. Blood seeped through his shirt as he stumbled forward, one hand pressed against the wound, the other still clutching the precious evidence. Bitter Creek was 3 miles back, too far to reach before blood loss took its toll. His only hope lay with Elijah's smithy on the town's edge, if he could circle around his pursuers. As consciousness threatened to fade, Caleb thought of Marlowe Thorne, waiting for dawn, and forced himself to keep moving. Doc Wilson's steady hands worked methodically to extract the bullet from Caleb's shoulder, the procedure illuminated by lantern light in Elijah's back room. Caleb gripped the edge of the workbench, knuckles white with pain, as the doctor probed the wound. "Bullet missed the bone, but you've lost a fair amount of blood," Doc Wilson muttered, finally removing the misshapen lead slug with a pair of forceps. "You're lucky to be alive, Marshal." The door opened and Sheriff Wade entered, his expression grim. He waited until Doc Wilson began cauterizing the wound before speaking. "He's moved the hanging to dawn," Wade announced. "Says new evidence confirms her guilt." "He's panicking," Caleb said through gritted teeth, as the hot iron seared his flesh. "Knows we're close." Wade removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. Victoria confronted him about the letters. "He threatened her, but she got away." "Where is she now?" Caleb asked, fighting to remain conscious through the pain. "Hiding at Sarah's," Elijah answered, stoking the forge where he'd heated the cauterizing iron. "But with you wounded and dawn coming—" "Then we work through the night," Caleb said firmly, refusing the laudanum Doc Wilson offered. "Pain keeps a man focused." Wade nodded. "I've got 2 deputies I trust watching the jail. But Blackwood's called in reinforcements from neighboring towns, deputies who owe him favors." "He's clearing the board," Caleb observed, "eliminating all threats at once." The evidence satchel sat open on the table beside them. Its contents, their only hope of stopping the execution, spattered with Caleb's blood. "Dawn's coming either way," Doc Wilson said quietly. "Question is, will justice arrive with it?" Midnight found Caleb Mackenzie battling demons more fearsome than Blackwood's gunmen. Fever from his wound had taken hold, plunging him into a realm where past and present collided in torturous clarity. He thrashed against the restraints Sarah had tied to keep him from reopening his wound, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool night air. "Cut him down, James!" Caleb shouted, reaching toward phantoms only he could see. "I have the evidence right here." Sarah Larson pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, her worried eyes meeting Doc Wilson's across the narrow cot. "Shh, Marshall, you're feverish. There's no one there." 3 years too late," Caleb muttered, his voice breaking. "Always too late." In his delirium, he was back in Kansas, watching his younger brother dangle from a rope, the corrupt judge refusing to delay the execution despite the evidence Caleb had ridden through the night to deliver. The same evidence that had disappeared mysteriously from the courthouse, just as Blackwood's records had vanished from his safe. "Please," Caleb whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Not again." The fever broke near dawn, leaving him weak but lucid. Sarah sat beside him, dozing in an uncomfortable chair, ink stains on her fingers, suggesting she'd been writing while keeping vigil. "My brother," Caleb said softly, causing her to stir. "Hanged for a murder he didn't commit. I had evidence clearing him, but the judge wouldn't delay the execution." Sarah straightened, relief evident in her tired eyes. "The fever's broken. That's why Marlowe's case matters so much to me," he continued, examining his bandaged shoulder with clear eyes. "It's why all of them matter. No one else dies because a judge says so." He tried to sit up, wincing at the pain but forcing himself upright. "How long until dawn?" 3 hours, Sarah replied, helping him to his feet. "Barely enough time." "It'll have to be," Caleb said, determination replacing the haunted look in his eyes. Moonlight cast iron bars across Marlowe's cell floor, the pattern reminiscent of the dawn that had begun this endless day. She sat on her cot, writing final thoughts on a scrap of paper Sarah had smuggled to her, when a soft noise at the window drew her attention. A woman's face appeared between the bars, half hidden by a dark veil. Victoria Blackwood's eyes were red-rimmed and fearful as she glanced over her shoulder before speaking. "Miss Thorne, I need to confess something," she whispered. "The necklace was never stolen." "I know that, Mrs. Blackwood," Marlowe replied evenly. Victoria reached through the bars, passing a small iron key. "For your shackles, when the time comes. Sheriff Wade has men loyal to him watching the jail, but they can't move until we have proof." "Proof of what?" "What you don't know is why," Victoria continued, her voice breaking. "Your sister Emma, she found papers in my husband's study. Papers proving he wasn't who he claimed to be." Marlowe's fingers tightened around the bars. "Where is she? Please. I came all this way." "I'm so sorry," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. When she confronted him, I heard the gunshot. He said she'd left town suddenly, but now I know better. Marlowe's world contracted to a pinpoint of grief, tears tracking silently down her face as the last hope for her sister died. All these months of searching, only to learn Emma had been gone before she'd even arrived in Bitter Creek. The marshal, Caleb Mackenzie, was wounded trying to get evidence to stop your hanging, Victoria continued, placing her hand over Marlowe's on the bars. But he's still fighting for you, for justice. Footsteps sounded in the distance, forcing Victoria to withdraw quickly into the shadows. "Dawn comes soon," she whispered. "Be ready." Marlowe clutched the key, grief hardening into resolve. Emma deserved justice, and now she knew exactly who owed that debt. Sheriff Wade stood in the shadows of the jailhouse basement, listening to sounds no lawman should allow under his roof. Elijah Freeman's muffled groans filtered through the heavy door, where Deputy Harkins and his men were attempting to extract the location of Caleb Mackenzie and the evidence against Blackwood. "Judge says keep going till he tells us where the marshal's hiding," Harkins instructed someone inside. Wade checked his revolver, confirming all 6 chambers loaded. The decision he'd been avoiding for 2 years crystallized in that moment. A man could only sell pieces of his soul for so long before nothing remained worth saving. He threw open the door, startling the 2 deputies inside. Elijah hung from ropes tied to a ceiling beam, his face bloody but defiant. "Take a break, Harkins," Wade said casually. "Let me try." The deputies exchanged glances before stepping outside, closing the door behind them. Wade immediately moved to Elijah, checking the severity of his injuries. "Won't tell. Nothing." Elijah mumbled through swollen lips. "I'm getting you out," Wade whispered, cutting the ropes with his knife. "Enough is enough." Elijah nearly collapsed as the ropes fell away. "Took you long enough, Sheriff." Wade supported the injured man's weight as they moved toward the back door. "Can you ride?" "Done worse. With worse," Elijah managed, his determination evident despite his injuries. Wade distracted the deputies with a bottle of whiskey before sneaking Elijah out through the storeroom. A horse waited in the alley behind the jail, saddled and ready. "Doc Wilson's," Wade instructed, helping Elijah into the saddle. "Marshal Mackenzie is there. Tell him Blackwood's called in every favor he's owed. There'll be 12 guns backing him at dawn." Elijah nodded, gathering the reins. "What about you?" "I've got my own debts to pay," Wade replied, slapping the horse's flank to send it galloping into the night. "Time to balance the books." The sheriff turned back toward his office, hand resting on his revolver. For the first time in years, the weight felt right. 2 hours before dawn, Doc Wilson's back room had transformed from a place of healing to a council of war. Caleb Mackenzie stood fully dressed in his marshal's attire, the silver badge on his chest catching the lamplight. His wound had been rebandaged, and though pain lines etched his face, his eyes were clear and focused. "At dawn, we don't just save one woman," Caleb addressed the unlikely alliance gathered before him. "We bring down a corrupt judge who's terrorized this town for years." Sheriff Wade checked his revolver methodically, the familiar routine steadying his nerves. "My deputies are divided. 4 stand with us, the rest with Blackwood. He's brought in 6 more from neighboring towns." "I've prepared this," Victoria said, passing Caleb a signed affidavit detailing her husband's true identity and crimes. "My testimony about the necklace and Emma Thorne's murder." Doc Wilson added his contribution, medical records documenting suspicious injuries and deaths, including a bullet he'd removed from Emma Thorne's shoulder before her body disappeared from his surgery. "And I have records of treating a man from Pennsylvania last year," Doc continued. "Claimed he was looking for Judge Blackstone, died of fever the next day, though the symptoms looked more like poison to these old eyes." "My press is ready," Sarah said, showing printed newspaper pages detailing Blackwood's crimes. "By noon, everyone will know what happened here, whatever the outcome." Elijah, his face bruised but his resolve unbroken, studied the town map spread across the table. "I can get us under the gallows through the mine tunnels. Support beams won't hold with a few strategic cuts." Caleb nodded, committing each detail to memory. "We move separately. Wade secures the jail. Victoria positions herself in the crowd. Sarah distributes these pages at first light. Elijah prepares the tunnel access. He checked his pocket watch. 90 minutes until dawn. Remember, Blackwood is desperate. That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him careless. The group dispersed into the pre-dawn darkness, each heading to their assigned positions. Caleb and Sheriff Wade walked together toward the jail, their breath forming clouds in the chill air. Victoria will confirm his identity from the crowd, Caleb explained. You'll back my play when I make the arrest. What if he orders deputies to proceed with the hanging anyway? Wade asked, voicing the concern that had haunted him through the night. Then I invoke federal authority to supersede his jurisdiction. Any man following his orders after that becomes an accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. Caleb adjusted his coat to better conceal his shoulder bandage. And if that doesn't stop them? Elijah asked, emerging silently from an alleyway to join their conversation. Caleb touched his holstered Colt. Then we have other arguments. They paused at a street corner, watching as Blackwood's imported deputies patrolled the town square where the gallows stood black against the lightening sky. Moment I show my badge, Blackwood will know his time's up, Caleb said. That's when he's most dangerous. He'll try to destroy the evidence, Wade predicted, or use Marlowe as leverage. That's why Victoria's testimony is crucial. Even without the documents, her word as his wife carries weight. Elijah nodded toward the jail. 2 guards at the front, probably more inside. How do we get to the girl? I've got men positioned to take the jail, Wade replied. Signals a church bell at first light. And I'll approach from the crowd, Caleb added. Drunk act one last time until I'm close enough to the gallows. The eastern sky had begun to pale, stars fading as dawn approached. The 3 men clasped hands briefly before separating, each moving to their positions as the town of Bitter Creek slept its final hours under Blackwood's shadow. Good luck, Wade said quietly. See you on the other side of dawn. While Wade coordinated with his loyal deputies, Caleb made his way toward Blackwood's garden. The judge's house stood dark and silent, most of the household still asleep. Security had been focused on the jail and gallows, leaving the rear garden relatively unguarded. According to Victoria, the garden was where Blackwood had buried documents, possibly the missing evidence from his safe. If Caleb could recover those papers before the execution, their case would be ironclad. He slipped over the wall with practiced stealth, despite his injured shoulder, landing silently among the rose bushes. Victoria had described the location precisely. 3rd rose bush from the left, near the stone bench. The eastern sky grew steadily lighter as Caleb knelt in the damp soil, digging carefully with a small trowel borrowed from Doc Wilson's surgery. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance, confirming Victoria's account. 6 inches down, his trowel struck something solid. Excitement flared as he excavated a small metal box similar to the one Victoria had described from the floorboard. But when he pried it open, Caleb found only damp earth and a single playing card, the Queen of Spades, with a crude gallows drawn across it. A message. Blackwood had moved the evidence and left a taunt in its place. In the distance, the first preparations for the execution began, voices calling, doors slamming, boots on wooden boardwalks. The execution procession would begin soon, with or without the buried evidence. Caleb pocketed the playing card and scaled the garden wall, his mind racing. Their strategy now hinged entirely on Victoria's testimony and the fragmentary evidence they'd already gathered. It would have to be enough. As he made his way toward the town square, Caleb saw Marlowe being led from the jail, deputies flanking her on either side. The noose swayed gently in the morning breeze, waiting to fulfill its purpose as the first rays of sunlight touched the gallows platform. Dawn broke over Bitter Creek in shades of flame and promise, illuminating the gallows where Marlowe Thorne stood with quiet dignity. The crowd had gathered earlier than usual, word of yesterday's disruption drawing curiosity seekers and those who sensed the winds of change. Judge Elliot Blackwood surveyed the assembly from the platform, his usual composure frayed at the edges. 6 armed deputies formed a perimeter around the gallows, while others patrolled the crowd. "We proceed without further delay," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying across the hushed square. "Justice deferred is justice denied." The executioner stepped forward to place the noose, but paused at a disturbance rippling through the crowd. A disheveled figure staggered forward, bottle in hand. Caleb Mackenzie reprising his drunkard's role one final time. "This an execution or a murder?" Caleb slurred loudly, drawing all eyes as he stumbled closer to the platform. "Remove that man," Blackwood ordered sharply. 2 deputies moved to intercept Caleb, but before they reached him, he straightened, discarded the bottle, and pulled aside his coat to reveal the silver badge of a U.S. Marshal. "Judge Elliot Blackwood," Caleb announced, his voice suddenly clear and authoritative. "Or should I say Henry Blackstone, former circuit judge of Pennsylvania. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, obstruction of justice, and murder." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Blackwood's face drained of color before flushing crimson. "This is absurd. I'll have you arrested for—" "For what?" Caleb interrupted, climbing the steps to the platform despite the deputies' uncertain postures. "For exposing how you stole $50,000 from the Pennsylvania courts, for revealing how you've murdered witnesses to protect your identity." Sheriff Wade stepped forward from the crowd, his star gleaming in the morning light as he took position beside Caleb. "Stand down, boys," he ordered the deputies. "This is a federal matter now." "This man is clearly delusional," Blackwood declared, maintaining his judicial demeanor despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "The execution will proceed as ordered." "I have documentation proving you are Henry Blackstone," Caleb countered, producing the Pennsylvania newspaper clipping and judicial badge. "I have witness testimony connecting you to the disappearances of 5 women who discovered your true identity." "Hearsay and fabrications," Blackwood dismissed, though his eyes darted nervously toward the crowd. "Deputies, proceed with the execution." The executioner looked uncertainly between Blackwood and Sheriff Wade, whose hand now rested meaningfully on his holstered revolver. "I wouldn't," Wade advised quietly. From the crowd, Victoria Blackwood stepped forward, removing her veil. "The marshal speaks the truth," she called, her voice trembling but resolute. "This man is not Elliot Blackwood, but Henry Blackstone, a fugitive from Pennsylvania justice. I found letters from his first wife, whom he still sends money to buy her silence." Blackwood's composed facade cracked. "Victoria, you foolish woman. I also confess," she continued, ignoring him, "that Marlowe Thorne never stole my necklace. My husband ordered me to claim it missing to silence her questions about her missing sister, Emma." Doc Wilson pushed through the crowd to stand beside Victoria. "Emma Thorne was brought to my surgery 3 months ago with a gunshot wound. Judge Blackwood claimed she'd had an accident. She disappeared from my care that night. And I have the bullet I removed from her shoulder," Doc added, holding up a small lead slug. "The same caliber as the judge's personal derringer." Blackwood's eyes darted frantically between the marshal, his wife, and the increasingly murmuring crowd. In a sudden movement, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a small derringer, aiming it directly at Caleb. "You've ruined everything," he snarled, his cultured voice giving way to desperate rage. Before he could fire, Elijah Freeman emerged from the crowd, hurling a blacksmith's hammer with practiced precision. The weapon struck Blackwood's hand, sending the derringer spinning away as he howled in pain. "You hanged innocent men!" Blackwood shouted, clutching his broken hand. "You had no right to dig into my past. I brought order to this town. I am the law." "No," Caleb replied calmly, handcuffs gleaming in the morning light as he approached the fallen judge. "You're just a thief and a murderer who hid behind a stolen gavel. And now you're a prisoner awaiting your own judgment." As the crowd watched in stunned silence, Sheriff Wade secured the handcuffs around Blackwood's wrists. By midday, the gallows that had nearly claimed Marlowe Thorne's life was being dismantled plank by plank. Townspeople worked together with newfound purpose, many still holding copies of Sarah Larson's special edition detailing Blackwood's crimes and the conspiracy that had nearly led to an innocent woman's execution. Blackwood, now acknowledged as Blackstone, sat in the same cell where Marlowe had awaited death, guarded by deputies loyal to Sheriff Wade, while awaiting transfer to federal custody. On the boardwalk outside the newspaper office, Caleb Mackenzie stood with Marlowe, watching the transformation taking place across town. "Your sister deserved justice," he said quietly. "I'm only sorry we couldn't save her." Marlowe nodded, grief and relief mingling in her expression. "For months I searched, town to town, following rumors. At least now I know the truth." She looked up at him. "What happens now?" "Blackstone will stand trial for Emma's murder, among other charges. With Victoria's testimony and the evidence we gathered, he'll hang by legal means this time." Sheriff Wade approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Stage for Denver leaves tomorrow morning. Thought you might want to know, Miss Thorne." "Denver," Marlowe repeated thoughtfully. "A fresh start." "The territorial governors appointed an interim judge," Wade continued. "Honest man, from what I hear. Town's got some healing to do." Caleb touched the badge on his chest, no longer hidden but displayed with renewed purpose. Marshall's office in Denver could use someone who knows the difference between law and justice. Marlowe smiled for the first time since Caleb had met her. Sounds like they already found him. As the sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows to hide secrets, Bitter Creek began its transformation from a town ruled by corruption to one guided by true justice. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but like the dawn that had brought truth to light, it carried the promise of something better. Caleb watched as the last piece of the gallows was carried away, a symbol of the past being dismantled to make way for the future. "Justice," he murmured, rough but true. "Well, partner, we've ridden a hard trail together through the dusty streets of Bitter Creek. If your heart's still pounding from that dawn confrontation, Caleb facing down Blackwood with nothing but truth as his weapon, Marlowe standing tall with that noose around her neck, know that mine is too. Stories about justice and redemption have a way of working themselves deep into our souls, leaving marks that remain long after the last page is turned. There's something about the frontier that strips away pretense, revealing the raw truth of who we really are." Caleb Mackenzie spent 3 years drowning his guilt in whiskey, believing his failure to save his brother had defined him forever. But redemption isn't found at the bottom of a bottle. It's forged in the crucible of action. In that moment when we choose justice over comfort, truth over safety. The badge Caleb finally wore openly wasn't just a symbol of authority, but of the man he'd chosen to become despite his broken past. What struck me most while crafting this tale was how corruption thrives in silence and isolation. Blackwood's power came from keeping people separate and afraid. But when Victoria spoke her truth, when Doc Wilson revealed what he knew, when Sheriff Wade finally chose right over easy, That's when justice became possible. One person standing alone can be silenced. Many standing together become unstoppable. I found myself thinking about the Judge Blackwoods of our own time, those who abuse authority and twist truth to serve themselves. They may not wear black robes or carry derringers, but they count on our fear of standing out, of risking what we have. Caleb's Wyoming territory might be long gone, but the choice between comfortable silence and costly truth remains as relevant as tomorrow's headlines. In the end, Bitter Creek learned what every frontier town eventually discovered. Justice isn't just a matter of law books and gallows, but of ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it matters most. Second chances aren't given. They're claimed, one difficult choice at a time. Thank you for walking these dusty streets with me. Your willingness to care about a drunken marshal, a falsely accused seamstress, and a town struggling to find its moral compass transforms these words into something that matters. Stories, like justice, require witnesses who are willing to see things through to the end. Caleb's story has me reflecting on the moments when justice hangs in the balance, those crossroads where speaking truth feels more dangerous than staying silent. We all face situations where doing right might cost us something precious, a job, a relationship, our comfortable place in a community. What's a time when you chose to stand up for what was right, despite the personal cost? Share your story in the comments, because courage deserves recognition, whether it happened on the frontier or in your everyday life. If Caleb and Marlowe's journey toward justice stirred something in your spirit, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and consider subscribing. The West is full of stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it matters most, and I'd be honored to share more of them with you. Until our trails cross again, may your aim be true and your conscience even truer.